This week, we're going to be discussing Chapter 7, which is level design, and that would be creating the world of your game. Some of the different questions we're going to answer are: what is level design and how is that related to gameplay? We're going to talk about the importance of the structural features of the game, such as the duration, how long the levels should last, the availability, the relationship between levels, and progression. We're going to talk about temporal features, which is time. Now we're talking about actually how time works in your game. And then we're going to talk about spatial features, camera, perspective, scale, and we'll end with a little bit of reality and style to give you the environment you want. So level design is defined as the creation of environments, scenarios, or missions in an electronic game. So you have a certain environment, that could be a level. You have a scenario, which is maybe a part of your story that you're going to have the player complete. That's a level. Or maybe there's a certain mission, you send your player on missions, and each mission could be a level. Most games are broken into levels, even really simple games. Even Farmville was broken into levels, right? You reached different levels because it gave you a feeling of progression. Each level you need to consider the goal, the flow, the duration, the availability, the relationship, and the difficulty of the level. And we're going to cover each of these individually. The function of the levels in a game are, first of all, to structure your game and organize it into subdivisions. So you break it up into pieces. You can also use levels to introduce new characters or objects to the game. You can focus on a particular plot point. You can create a mood. You can change the mood depending on the environment the player walks into for the level or the story line that's going on. And levels give the player a feeling that they have actually progressed. So you reach a new level, yay, I've completed the level, I have done something in the game, I've progressed in the game. So let's talk about structure. The structure of the level should take in consideration the different things that I just mentioned, the goal, the flow, the duration. So we're going to talk about each of those. So the first one is the goal, which is the objective of the particular level. So you want to make sure that the player understands the goal at the beginning of the level. They know what they need to do in order to complete the level. And you might show them this by using a cutscene. You might have it as part of a tutorial. Maybe you give them progress reports. They can see what level they're on. They can see how far they are. Maybe you show them the map and they can see how far they've progressed in an area. Maybe they know how many monsters they've killed or how much gold they've collected. Something to show them how far they've gotten through the level. You might show them a status screen to show them where they are in the level. But you need to make sure that they know the goal of the level, what they need to do to complete the level. Levels should also have flow, meaning one should flow into the next. Sometimes you want to make sure that your player stays on a particular level until it's completed. So maybe you have locked doors or some way to keep your player on that level so that they don't go ahead without having the skills that they need to move ahead. Sometimes you can not let your player return to a level. Some games your players can go back and play levels again, but other games, once you've gotten past the level, you can't go back. So that's something that you need to decide in your game. Do you want the player to be able to go back and repeat a level? Or once they're done with the level, do you want that to be closed off to them? In which case, you really have to make sure that they've done everything they need to do in order to move on to the next level so that they don't miss some important aspect of that level. before moving on. What's the duration going to be of the level? How long is it going to take for the player to complete the level? How much time do you want the player to stay on the level? And that also depends on the type of game and the actual player. Obviously, children are going to have much shorter levels, right? Maybe 15 minutes at the most, whereas a hardcore gamer could be on a level for an hour or two. So as long as they feel somehow that they are progressing. So that's something that you need to make sure you keep in mind when you are designing your levels. What's the availability of the level? So do you want all the levels in the game to be available at the same time? Do you want the players to go from level to level? That is something else that you need to decide. So a game I used to love to play on the PS2 way back when was Gauntlet Dark Legacy. And in order to get to the levels, you had to collect these gems. And once you had enough gems, the next level opened up to you. So you couldn't move on until you had enough gems. But once the level opened up, you could go back and complete that level again. I remember there was one level that you got a whole lot of gold at the end. So we would play that level several times and build up our gold, which helped us to build up our achievements. So that was an interesting way to have the game, that you needed a certain number of gems in order to get to the levels, but once you got to a level, they were available to you for repeating. So that's something that the designers decided to do, and it was very effective. But that's what you would need to do when you are creating a game. Design how you want your levels to be available to the player. Next, there needs to be a relationship between the levels. Sometimes the level just, you progress and you gather experience points and you level up, yay. So the relationship isn't that, it's just that it has to do with your experience. So there isn't much of a relationship except that more experience means a higher level. Sometimes the relationship between the level is you move from one area into another area in the game, maybe in the environment, or you suddenly have bigger monsters to fight. So you need to make those decisions about how the levels relate to each other. If they're completing, if it's a mission, well now, you've completed one mission, so now you can go on to another mission, and how are those two missions related? If it has to do with the story progression, how does this next level add to the story? What happens if you give the player options of going in one direction or another direction? Make sure that the relationship between the levels stays consistent. And then they talk about progression. Progression has to do with difficulty progression. There's 3 types of difficulty progression, and notice there is a little bit of an error in this graph here, in this picture that's in your textbook. So this line here, that is called a flat progression. You can see it's incorrect here. They're showing the red one as flat, but it's not. This yellow one, orange one is flat, meaning that as you go through time, the difficulty stays the same. Okay, now it could be that the difficulty sort of is getting harder, but relative to the player, in the player's perspective, the difficulty stays the same. So as the player gets more efficient at the game, better at playing the game, things get more difficult, but the player doesn't feel like it's more difficult. Then there is a linear progression. That's this one here. The linear progression means that as the game goes on, it gets more and more difficult, and the player perceives it as getting more difficult, but they're able to accomplish the tasks because they have more skills, even though the tasks are getting more difficult. And then we have what's called an S-curve. An S-curve is, as time goes on, it gets really difficult, and then at the end it kind of flattens out. So it goes from sort of flat, and then in the middle it grows in difficulty, and then it sort of flattens out again. So I'm sure you can think of games that you've played that have one of these three types of difficulty progression, and those are important to think about how you want to design your levels, how you want the difficulty to progress. Next, we'll talk about time. Now, before we talked about time intervals, and that had to do with the pacing of the game. This time, we're talking about actual time and how actual time works in your game. So there are different ways that you can deal with time in your games, in your levels. The first is to have authentic time, and that is where a minute in real life is a minute in gameplay. Okay, time is authentic. So, like in Farmville, if they tell you it's going to take 8 hours for a certain plant to grow and it takes literally 8 hours, then that's authentic time. So you might have your game have authentic time. Now, that could also be interesting because maybe at nighttime your game gets darker. Maybe you show the time with the sun. Maybe if at nighttime certain characters can see better because it's nighttime. So that's something that you can use in your game. Next, we have what's called limited time. Limited time means things go a little faster. So here they're showing Farmville. Farmville is not really limited time. It is more of a real-time game. But in some games, what I think they're referring to here is you have a certain amount of time to complete a task. So they might give you a certain amount of time to complete some tasks, and then you get a reward. So that would be limited time. Then we have variable time. This is where you can have the game sometimes go faster. Time sometimes go faster in the game, and sometimes it's slower. So like, for example, in The Sims, you're playing the game when the player's awake. The days go by at sort of, slower time, and then they go to sleep, and a minute later they're awake again. So nighttime goes really fast. So that's variable time, where sometimes the time is slower and other times the time is faster. And you can put that into your game. Player-adjusted time is where the player can actually adjust the time. So if you're playing maybe a football game, you can decide, well, maybe I don't want a quarter to be 15 minutes long like it is in real life. Maybe I want the quarter to only be 5 minutes long. So you allow the player to adjust that time, and then the game goes a little faster. And then finally, there's what we call altered time. That's sort of like bullet time, or in the Matrix, when everything slows down for one person, and they can see the bullet. That's why it's bullet time. You can see the bullet traveling through and coming towards you, and then you can dodge so that the bullet doesn't hit you. So that would be altered time. In Gauntlet Dark Legacy that I talked about earlier, there were certain places where you would hit this little time thing and time would slow down, and so you could get a whole bunch of stuff done while you're still going at regular time, but things around you kind of froze. And so you could, through that altered time, you can progress faster. Here they have Prince of Persia, The Forgotten Sands, and time is altered. That's a whole aspect of that game, is that time gets altered. You can go back in time, forward in time, and alter time. Next, we'll talk about space. Okay, and when we talk about space in your level, we're talking about the perspective or the camera, and we're going to talk about the different types of perspective and camera that we have. The first one is omnipresent. So this is where you allow your player to see the entire game at once. Maybe there's different areas on a map that they can go to, but they can see the whole map. They can see the whole world at one time. So that's called omnipresent perspective. Then you have what's called aerial or top-down. That's where the player looks down on the game. So something like Legend of Zelda or Pac-Man, the player is looking down on the game and can see the area that they're in right there. They can't see the entire world, but where they're looking down on it. Another view that's similar to that is called isometric. Isometric view is that the player is looking at kind of a 30 to 45 degree angle. It makes things look more three-dimensional. So if you have an isometric view, that's kind of a perspective trick that allows objects that are farther away to be smaller and closer to you are a little larger, and so it looks a little more three-dimensional. Another perspective is a side-scrolling perspective, and a lot of platformers are done this way, obviously. You see them from the side, and the players move left, right, up, and down, but you're getting a side perspective or flat view of their environment. Now, there are some other perspective tricks that can make objects look three-dimensional. With that side scrolling, there's something called parallax scrolling, and what that does is different layers move in different directions. So you might have your character moving right, but the background at the same time moves left, and it makes the game look much more three-dimensional instead of just looking flat. You can also draw your objects so that there's a vanishing point where everything comes towards the center and gets gets smaller as it goes back until it hits what we call a vanishing point. You can use shading to make things look three-dimensional, where you shade objects that causes them to look like they have 3 dimensions in space. Also on paper, if you are drawing your background or your characters, just keep in mind that objects look farther away if they're smaller and higher up on the page, and they look closer if they're larger and lower down on the page. So those are some other perspective tricks. So we also talk about terrain and materials when we're talking about our levels, and this is what the environment materials look like, such as metal, glass, sand, gravel, sky, water. So you want things to have different textures depending on what you want the environment to look like. So if you want things to look shiny, if you want to have shadows, those are all things that you can add to your game to make the terrain and the materials look realistic, make the players have a mood. It sets the mood better. If you make things darker, then they're scarier. If you make things lighter, it's not as scary. You can have leaves moving or shadows on the ground or water flowing. These are all things that you want to think about to create your environment. Radiosity and effects, that has to do with lighting and shadows. It also has to do with reflection. So how does light reflect on things? How do you show rain and snow and lightning in your game? How do you show water moving? Things like that. And a lot of radiosity and effects are done through animation. And then there's scale. You want to think of the size of your world, the size of things. And Scale can be kind of interesting because you can have a character walking around outside and seeing little buildings, and then they walk into a building and suddenly the building seems huge. So the perspective, the scale of the buildings changes depending on what the player is doing. Think of Grand Theft Auto too. You're outside driving around, you can see the tops of the buildings, you can see the streets and all the cars, but then if your character walks into a building, suddenly it's the whole screen. So scale is something to think about, and it's okay to change the scale in your game if you can make the player feel like that's realistic. And then there's boundaries. You need to think about the boundaries of your environment. Now, you can have a physical boundary, like putting a wall around, or maybe your game is on an island, and so obviously the player, can't swim off the island, say. Or maybe your area is surrounded by mountains, and so the player knows they can't go over the mountains. You can physically keep the player from going in a certain area, and then that is a way to have your boundary. Or you can at least give the player a feeling like there's a boundary, that they can't go in a certain place. So think about how you want to show your boundaries, because obviously there have to be some kind of boundaries in your levels. You might want to think about having realism in your game. Sometimes people put backgrounds with using actual photographs to make it real, or unless you're very good at drawing. But things like games like True Crime, Streets of LA, they took miles and miles and miles of photographs of LA and then used that in the background for the game so that it looks totally realistic. So that's something to think about. How realistic do you want your game to be? Now, you might not use realism. That might not be part of what you want your levels to look like, but that's something that is possible. So in general, you want to think about the style of your game, the style of your environment. You want it to be consistent. You want it to be consistent with the story, be consistent with the characters. Decide, are you going to just have drawings and make it look really cute and pixelated? Is it going to be realistic? Notice on the left, you have this beautiful grass, and now you might need to think about the wind and how it would react with the grass, and how it would move, or smoke rising, so these are very realistic styles that are shown in these pictures, but you don't have to have it be realistic. Just make sure that the style of your game is consistent throughout the entire game, consistent from level to level. So that is pretty much the end of the chapter, just a pretty short chapter. We talked about level design, we talked about the structure of levels, we talked about time and space, and that levels have to do with your gameplay and your story. So when you're thinking about creating a game, make sure you take all of this into consideration when you are designing your levels. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you next week.